Hey, Social Work 220. I just wanted to follow up on the discussion that we had in the last module about social change and macro change over the years. So the next part I wanted to talk about really was moving into the 60s. Now, there's a couple big things that are happening in the 60s, and that's that there are a lot of people now going to college. But more importantly than a lot of people going to college were women were starting to go to college. And that made a huge difference because now you had people of two genders really getting together, spending time together, talking a lot, and they were discovering things in college about the world. One of the things that happens in college, you may not have noticed this, but there should be a lot of free time on your hands, at least when you go between those 18 and 21 years. And students were going away and they were finding things that were a problem in the world and they wanted to fix it. One of the things that was going on was a fight against poverty. There was a recognition through President Johnson that there was poverty all over the United States, and there was that war on poverty going on. And that was really making people aware of what was happening to people in Appalachia as well as the cities. Coming along with that, you're probably all aware there was an initial war on racism. Martin Luther King began to get active. There were sit-ins in different ways, Rosa Parks on the bus, ways of saying we're not going to do this separate but equal kind of thing anymore. Along with that going on, there was the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was seeing everybody being drafted who was not away in college. So these students who were away in college were noticing that the people they went to high school with were dying in war. And so the confluence of all of these people on college campuses talking about what was happening to people in Vietnam, awareness of racism, awareness of poverty, started to get people acting out. It was a real macro change that started happening, real social work kind of stuff. And here's the reality. In these macro changes, there have always been a few things that go on. Politicians get interested, community activists get involved. In these cases in the 60s, the community activists were often college campuses and students on those campuses. And social workers tend to be involved because they're the ones who are bringing the issue to the people they deal with every day. They bring the evidence that there's a problem because they're the ones who are seeing the clients that need the systemic change that comes from macro changes. So we also started to see some other progress made in the 60s as a result of those people out there saying we don't like it anymore. One was changes to welfare so that there was more of an understanding that people need a lift up. There were changes to the educational system that allowed for special education to begin and that also allowed for women to start saying that they should have the same opportunities in education as women, as men. And then there was the huge difference and change in feminism. This is something I grew up during, being born in 1960. I was, 10 as they were really making progress, but I remember it. I remember the protests and the bra burnings and everything that women were doing, and they were trying to get reproductive rights. They were trying to have a place in the workplace. There used to be, if you looked in the help wanted ads, there would be men jobs and women jobs. They wanted it to be a whole universe. And so they started trying to become more and more independent. So we have women's rights out there now. We have anti-war out there now. We have racism issues being fought out there. And a lot of change occurred. A lot of change happened. You start to see that this is probably the biggest change in the United States that came about since the Revolutionary War without a war. So then we move into the 70s, and if any of you have had my class before, you know that in the mid-70s is when we started to get truly effective child abuse laws. It's the first rape and domestic violence abuse laws that we're really taking hold of and that were mandated from federal standards down to states. We started to see victim rights groups develop at the end of the 70s and into the 80s, and victim rights have continued to grow ever since. In 1994, then Senator Biden introduced the Women Against Violence Act, and that was a huge step in getting all victims more rights. As we also went into the 80s and 90s, another thing that came up that became a big macro issue was HIV. And the fight against HIV, which was when I was just getting out of social work school, was interesting because people were petrified of this disease. They acted like they did in the beginning of COVID all the time. But the gay community happened to take advantage of community activists, the arts communities, and they started to educate people. But more importantly, they started demanding changes. And they got the attention of politicians and the attention of medical groups, and the research happened. And they found all the medication that has come a long way in helping people who are diagnosed with HIV to survive. But an outgrowth of that as well, a positive outgrowth, was that more and more people were now able to talk about the fact that they were gay. They were able to come out to their families. When that started to first happen in the 70s and 80s, I have to tell you, it was so unusual. So it's interesting for me to be part of a world now where it's not unusual at all. And it's part of your world that many of you have grown up in, where it hasn't even been a problem. So a couple other things that happened in the 90s, women started to get into the military more, started being able to go to full-blown military academies. Stalking laws came. That's something that we never had before. There was a TV show, Mork and Mindy, and one of the women in that TV show was stalked and murdered. And after that, that brought attention. Again, sometimes there's got to be that community event or something happens that starts to bring people's attention to it. Social workers who'd had clients for years who'd been stalked by ex-boyfriends or ex-girlfriends were able to go to politicians and say, we've got to change laws. We need to have some stalking laws. We are just starting to make progress on that. Which brings us to today. And so you might think, wow, there's all that progress, nothing still to work on. But there's lots to still work on, right? So we'll deal with that a little bit more in this module, but just to give you a hint of some things, obviously police violence is big, right? Racism, still an issue. Gun violence, still an issue. Mental illness has still never had its time to really be dealt with, and mental illness in our jails today is huge. And transgender issues. So we still have some work to do as social workers. There will always be ways to improve, but let's deal a little bit more with some macro issues with this week's assignment. Thanks.